This week, since we're talking origin stories, it seems fitting that we end up back at an opening battle of the Revolutionary War and get a peek into the realities of access to drugs when ill or wounded in the 18th century and what that really meant. That means we get to visit the Ebenezer Fisk home site in Minuteman National Historical Park that lies between the towns of Lexington and Concord, northwest of Boston in Massachusetts. This home lay near enough to the fighting that young Mrs. Rebecca Fisk, the wife of the younger Mr. Fisk, was observing the combat from her home. Part of the reason for this was her father-in-law being so ill that he was bedridden. Before things got really bad, there was both no easy way to move him and no good place to move him to. But as the conflict became more heated and approached their farm, they took the desperate step of moving Ebenezer Fisk in his bed onto an ox cart in an attempt to move him to a safer place. And I cannot emphasize enough that the beds of this day were large wooden constructions and often one of the most important and significant pieces of furniture in most homes at this time. Home furnishings aside, the more pertinent part of the action was the relative speed of wound and healthcare in that day, and the fact that most of it was rather slow. It arrived at foot speed, on dirt roads, sometimes in a horse cart and occasionally on fleeter horseback. But even once healthcare arrived, water had to be drawn from wells, and if heated, done so over a fire or on a wood stove. And in this case, for soldiers found shot on the home site, any water heating would have had to wait for the restarting of a fire. And remember, no matches. And while we take for granted the arrival of pain relief, that was an unlikely item for men wounded in the field in this age. There might be administration of some anesthesia later, but it was limited and most likely to be found in the hospitals accessible to officers and in places that were closest to cities, which had the laboratory facilities to store and manufacture the limited supplies of pain-relieving drugs. The Fisk House and the entire Minuteman Park. The way this park and battlefield is surrounded by houses, farms, businesses, and even an airport is one of the few commemorated battlefields that can try to bring home that war usually takes place in the middle of people's lives. Residents of the United States of America have been uniquely protected from this reality. Most of America's fighting has been overseas, or at the borders of other states, or in the name of expansion. That is, the fighting happens before people in homes and buildings of the Americans arrive. If anything, the country has a unique blind spot. Rarely has war happened upon our doorsteps. Minuteman Park, between Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, offers a little glimpse of the proximity of war in a front yard. And, for our concerns, how once war happened, how it catches up non-combatants, and how slowly help arrives, if it can ever arrive at all. Episode 113. Drugs in the Age of War and Adventure. Way more than you thought. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the surprising range of non-nutritive psychoactive substances available for use by the New Americans between the years 1776 and 1815. I was rather surprised by the range, and you might be too. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the 18th century was an explosion of the new chemistry, which was working to bury alchemy firmly in the dust. And the arm of chemistry that produced some of the wildest effects on humans was organic chemistry. That is the chemistry of carbon-containing compounds. And this explosion of exploration into organic chemistry did what always seems to happen with great leaps forward in science. Lots of effort went into the production of drugs. It seems to be a very human reaction. Leaps forward in visual media seem to produce new and more sexually charged imagery, and advances in science seem to produce new drugs. But big philosophical pronouncements I'd love to talk over aside, let's look at the crop of drugs that were available or more available to the new Americans during this period of war and adventure. Pain relief and access to most of the thing we think of as drugs now was mostly only available to the wealthy. Other than alcohol, that is. And in these early days of their recognition, many of them were used only for entertainment, not for anesthesia or pain relief. I know, I was a little surprised too. Food of this age was largely seen as fuel, and that's all. A far cry from our modern interest in food as medicine, or at least as a wellness adjunct. The trend of what people are calling nutraceuticals, I know, it's a terrible word. So why am I including this stuff in my historical food podcast, if much or all of it wasn't regarded as food at the time? Partly because researching it was made a bit difficult. Our national puritanical hangover made researching the presence of drugs labeled illegal now, in a general overview way, surprisingly difficult. Instead, they're often covered by cobwebs of legend, misinformation, censure, and shameful thrills. I'd wanted to get my typical general overview peek like I do for things like salt pork or tea or milk or whatever. But instead, it's this weird treasure hunt amongst what's true and what's fantastical and agenda driving. So sure, part of it was getting through my annoyance, but mostly it was my regular inspiration. As with everything else, to understand how we got to now, I needed to see how we began. And now that I've banished a bunch of the obscuring cobwebs, let's jump in. The oldest drug in use in America was alcohol, and we've covered that. But probably the second oldest drug in use in America was cannabis, or as most early Americans knew it, hemp. And here's the funny thing. Just as rum is really repackaged industrial waste from sugar production, the psychoactive elements of hemp, the cannabinoids, are also a repackaged byproduct of the production of fiber and food from the hemp or cannabis plant. I mean, well, yeah, the hand-shaped jagged edge leaf is the modern symbol. Most people before the 20th century thought of that as a sideline. What really mattered to most people were the tall stalks. Once dried, soaked, and beaten and treated a few different ways, they make a bundle of long, shiny, tough fibers that are useful for making rough cloth, paper, and most important for every seafaring nation on the globe, rope. Every sailing vessel taking to the open seas for centuries would have a ton or two of rope aboard. And for the majority of boats, the sails aloft were also made of cloth of those hemp or cannabis fibers. The name might ring a bell. Canvas. Now this plant is very hardy and like corn has a wide growing range. They're lowland, highland, tropical, and temperate varieties. In fact, some people noting its hardiness have commented that it grows like a weed. As a result of its cooperative growing habit and its near essential role in seafaring, even before the Jamestown colony had become particularly successful at growing tobacco, it was ordered by the Crown administrators to get busy and start growing hemp to make money and top up naval stores, which they did. Okay, you ask, so were people smoking hemp all the way back then? Yes, and earlier. For utter squares like me who like everything with historical context, here's a little background. There are two main species of cannabis, C. sativa and C. indica. Sativa was originally heavily cultivated as a fiber plant and a source of oily, nutritious seeds. Incidentally, sativa or sativum is a Latin term indicating cultivated. That is to say, this was a domesticated crop bred to fulfill human needs. For example, garden peas are Pisum sativum. It's much the same way that plant species that end with officinalis indicate that they are recognized as an important medicinal or culinary item. So things like rosemary, asparagus, and even dandelion have scientific names that end in officinale or officinalis. C. sativa, for obvious economic reasons, was the variety most cultivated in the Americas in its early days. Smoking the leaves or combinations of leaves and female inflorescences would have brought some ease, but it definitely lacked the punch of the leaves of the new botanical hotness, tobacco. The other main variety, C. indica, was still used somewhat for its fibery goodness, but was largely brought into the Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia associated with Hinduism and some of the other religions of the Indian subcontinent. In its early days, it was mostly ingested or inhaled as part of medicinal incense mixtures. The activity of inhaling the smoke directly through a pipe seems to be a result of C. indica traveling to East Africa, where there was already a tradition of smoking herbs in gourd pipes for different ceremonial and medicinal purposes. A 2019 book, The African Roots of Marijuana by Chris Duval from Duke University Press, held all sorts of surprises regarding yet more African traditions that are to be found at the back of American habits. So the American sailors heading over to the Mediterranean to fight the pirates of the Barbary States might have been exposed to the more potent C. indica that Napoleon was issuing prohibitions about as he invaded Egypt in 1798, but your average hemp-smoking American was dealing with the most low-level C. sativa type, sort of the small beer of cannabis, to bring back a comparison from episodes 20 and 21. And really, in these years, tobacco was where all the action lived. After alcohol, it was the most commonly ingested drug. It made money, it was compact, stable, and well understood, and it had predictable potency. Whereas hemp was poorly understood and cultivated as a drug more as a curiosity. It might have some effect, it might not, and much of the relaxation might come just from the act of sitting back and contemplating the blowing smoke. The extracts of cannabis that will make a splash, those come later. So here we are with the tied for second oldest drug in play in early America. Whether tobacco or cannabis use is older, that's somebody else's fight. For fun, it's worth noting that the earliest colonial exposure to tobacco ingestion was as a snuff, that is, inhaling a dust of the dried ground leaves, or by inhaling the smoke through a nose pipe. The long pipes Sir Walter Raleigh is shown smoking were used by the locals in Virginia, a different ingestion method than the Caribbean nose pipes. But a wooden or reed and clay or stone pipe, nearly as tall as the smoker, was distinctly inconvenient. As a result, the British wasted little time in developing pipes that were all clay, getting rid of the wood bits. These clay pipes would also become handy archaeological markers for the next 2 centuries, because these white clay pipes were absolutely everywhere for our soldiers and adventurers. Breaking a pipe was common, and being a pipe maker was a high turnout job. By the 18th century, a skilled pipe maker could turn out 3,000 pipes each and every week. As a result, the broken pipe stems and pipe bowls can be handy in marking and even dating lines of march for soldiers and their encampments. Pipe styles change just about as rapidly as all manufactured things do. And because these pipes were disposable, they're found just about everywhere. American littering, it's also a long habit. After tobacco, the next drug we get to, opium. Yet another contender for the second oldest drug. Look, with these things that just grow up out of the ground around people who don't write things down or have their writings destroyed, it gets very hard to establish oldest. But of the 3 plant-derived drugs, opium had the least reach. At this point in America, no opium was grown there. All of it was imported. At this time, mainly from Indian sources controlled by Britain, though some also came in through the emerging American-China trade. And all opium in this age was not smoked. Instead, it was ingested, mostly in liquid form as laudanum. Commonly, it was an approximately 10% solution of opium dissolved in a distilled alcohol solution. That is, it was dissolved in rum or brandy. And it was bitter. Though considered useful for the chronic pain brought on by things like kidney stones, gout, or advanced arthritis. It might also be given for acute pain, wounds from accidents, duels, or wars. And of course, there was its most common usage to help women deal with their female troubles. But as it was a relatively rare and expensive medicine at this point, it was mainly available to the rich. And the expense, rarity, and uneven potency meant that addiction was limited. And the majority of early American addicts were rich older women who had been given laudanum regularly by flummoxed or annoyed male doctors. In fact, Eliza Smith's The Complete Housewife, a cookbook that went through several editions in the 1720s and 30s in England, as well as many American reprints, has a recipe for the best laudanum. To a quart of sack, that is a sweet wine, and a cup of spirit of wine, that is heavily fortified wine or simply distilled wine, one should add 4 ounces of opium along with 2 ounces of saffron and an ounce of salt of tartar. To smooth things out, a dram each of cinnamon, cloves, and mace should be added as well. Placed in the sun or by the fire for about 20 days in a well-corked bottle, it could brew. Then it should be poured off the dregs and it would be fit for use in doses of 10, 15, 20, or even 25 drops. And with that ingredient list, saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and mace on top of the opium, I hope that makes it clear that this was a drug of the well-to-do. And a few famous trust fund kids were playing about with laudanum, the best known of which is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, author of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is the source of the line, "Water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink," as well as the popularization of the idea that killing albatrosses will get you into trouble at sea. He's also pretty well known for writing the poem Kubla Khan and brought the idea of Xanadu and the Chinese-Mongol kingdom to popular awareness in Europe and later to naughty, boundary-pushing American readers. He was also notable for dabbling in one of the newest drugs of the age, nitrous oxide. The late alchemists and early chemists of the 18th century were notorious for continuing to gather information about the chemicals they were finding by inhaling, eating, and drinking them. And it is Joseph Priestley, the chemist fascinated with figuring out gases, who is credited with recording and explaining early nitrous oxide in 1772. This gas, produced initially by exposing ammonium nitrate, of fertilizer fame, to iron filings, and then bubbled through water to remove other noxious contaminants, was immediately noted for its euphoric effects. It was rapidly added to the list of things rich people did to make parties more entertaining. Though I'm getting a little ahead of myself, it is illustrative of how this chemical was viewed to know that Samuel Colt in the 1830s sold balloons of nitrous oxide to people for their entertainment as a way of raising money to manufacture his earliest pistols. It wasn't until the 1840s that therapeutic uses, that is, its use as anesthesia, was considered for what we generally know as laughing gas. And as the newest drug, it of course was the most popular amongst the well-connected. It wouldn't have been used in war, but it certainly would have been offered to a rich young officer on leave and looking for relaxation and diversion. The last big drug in use, again, not in the field, but by those looking for entertainment and escape, was ether, or more exactly, diethyl ether. That is, 2 ethyls, or C2H5s, connected to a center oxygen. This fairly volatile organic compound was originally produced in the 16th century by the action of sulfuric acid, that is, oil of vitriol, on fortified wine, or a potent source of ethyl alcohol. By the late 18th and early 19th century, while laughing gas was for the rich, ether was more for the middle class and for the poor. Drinking ether, or doping other alcoholic drinks with ether to make them stronger, would bring on unconsciousness faster. And ether frolics, that is, draping each other's faces with ether-soaked cloths as everyone got less coherent and then eventually passed out, was another method of entertainment and escapism. Once again, using ether to make surgery more tolerable wasn't considered until the late 1830s. But beyond these substances recognized in our age as drugs and medicines, there were any number of potions, brews, tinctures, lozenges, oils, drops, cordials, washes, powders, ointments, conserves, spirits, balsams, waters, clysters, salves, plasters, filters, vomits, antidotes, and so on, made from a large variety of botanical items, as well as things like iron filings, chunks of sulfur, additions of charcoals, and minerals, as well as all manner of contributions from animal sources, dung, horns, antlers, shells, bones, and gallstones being the most common, though there is one kidney stone cure that starts out with oven-dried bees. Found in the back of cookbooks, these remedies fell firmly in the realm of women's work, but possibly most importantly, they all required the tools and stable location of a well-stocked kitchen. You needed a still room and the still, cauldrons, fires, storage jars, mortars, pestles, sugar, kegs of potent alcohols, and a wide range of stored and dried herbs, spices, and farm animals to provide all the materials that were required to produce all of these mixtures. And while most of these items didn't persevere, though the ginger and turmeric cordial for stomach complaints looks a bit inviting, the more potent drugs of the earlier centuries, alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, opium, and cannabis, as well as the more recent additions of ether and nitrous oxide, are with us and are used, regulated, revered, and vilified in various ways. So it was clear, at this point, food and medicine are two entirely separate realms. There were definitely meals and foods that were fed to the sick to help them recover or were easy to digest. Food was food, and medicines were entirely separate. Drugs and cures mostly came to the wealthy or those with well-provisioned homes. For people on the road, for most of them, the best they could hope for was maybe a shot of whiskey and a good lie-down. After all, at this time of such a tight food economy, for most people, especially while on the move, the question wasn't better or worse food, rather it was food or no food. There was almost no idea that some foods were therapeutic or healthier or unhealthy. But amazingly, such an idea is right around the corner. But next week, it's time to wrap up this period of war and adventure and figure out, what did we learn? Did it change any of our attitudes towards food? And there'll be a little more discussion of why people hung around in the military and went on adventures if the food was so bad. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. Want more food and history in your future? Then come visit my other podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. With the help of co-host Jamie Lewis from Plague of Strength, we're looking at modern media that deals with the 19th century. It's much looser and rather wilder. There's still food, but now fashion, fighting, and fraud. And drugs. There are a lot of drugs in the 19th century. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta as @THOAFood, but these days I'm mostly X'd out. And all of this information is available in the show description.